2 years ago, our next guest endured the most unimaginable loss, that of her 13-year-old son, Daniel, to a rare bone cancer. Determined to find a cure, this NASA space engineer carried out a statistical and pattern detection analysis of osteosarcoma genetics, collecting more than 130 genetic codes from 100 young patients. Here to share the hope that may be on the horizon for a cure of this deadly cancer, please welcome Theresa Beech.
I'm here to tell you a story, the story of a boy, a brave, beautiful, and beloved boy. It's the story of my son, Daniel. When my Daniel had a smile that could light up a crowd, it could light up a room, he never stopped smiling. He loved to spend time with his friends and play sports. He was the captain of his basketball team. The boys liked him, the girls liked him, even the little kids on the street just thought he was the bomb, and even his teachers liked him in spite of what was frankly a very mediocre academic performance. He was a charming, smiling goofball. And at the age of 11, he was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, a fairly common pediatric cancer. Through 2 years of treatment, 15 operations, 20 rounds of high-dose chemotherapy, sepsis, 130 nights in the hospital, radiation, clinical trials, and more. He smiled, and he smiled, and he smiled, and he never gave up. And because Daniel never gave up, I couldn't give up either, even when he was dying. So I taught myself genetics so that I can do what I do best, analyze data, the genetic data in his tumor. In doing this, I was able to identify 2 drugs which targeted mutations in his tumor, and I convinced his doctors to prescribe them for him. Instead of dying within a couple of weeks of his terminal diagnosis, as all of his doctors expected, given the highly aggressive nature of his disease, he lived almost 6 more months, 6 precious, life-filled months. But on August 28th, 2016, Daniel died from osteosarcoma. He was 13. As my 25-year-old nephew, a US Marine, said to me the day after Daniel died, Daniel was tough, really, really tough. My smiling, happy, charming kid was the toughest, bravest person I have ever met. So what is this disease which killed my boy? Osteosarcoma is the most common form of a primary bone cancer. It's also the oldest known form of cancer. It's been found in early hominid fossils from about 2 million years ago. And it occurs throughout the animal kingdom in vertebrates like dogs, cats, goats, bunnies, etc. In humans, it most commonly affects children, adolescents, and young adults. And it has a treatment protocol that is one of the most challenging, aggressive, and damaging in all of oncology. Osteosarcoma is also the leading cause of death by disease for kids ages 10 to 20 in the United States. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids every year who die from osteosarcoma. The year Daniel died, there were 10 local kids near us who died from osteosarcoma. And in my county, at any given time, there are between 2 and 3 kids dying from osteosarcoma. And the situation that what is happening today is the same as what was happening 10 years ago and 20 years ago and even 30 years ago, because the treatment protocol for osteosarcoma is exactly the same as it was 30 years ago. Identical. Our grand sum total of our medical progress in osteosarcoma over the last 30 years is exactly equal to 0. That's pretty bleak and hopeless. But I believe that it is when life is darkest and bleakest that we most need hope. We need to create our own hope, based in the current reality, but which imagines a better future, a future in which kids survive osteosarcoma and thrive, a future in which a child like my Daniel is alive and well. So how do we do that? When Daniel was dying, he told me I had to keep going with my work. And so, because I love him, and I will always love him, I have continued with my work in osteosarcoma genetics research. In not quite 2 years, I've gotten IRB approval for POWER, which is now the largest repository of genetic and medical history data for osteosarcoma in the world. Using this data, I found that in at least 90% and possibly 100% of all osteosarcoma tumors, p53 has been inactivated. There are also seven statistically significant and biologically relevant genetic subtypes of osteosarcoma, and they correspond to different disease progressions, different outcomes, and different responses to chemotherapy. There are two genes, MYC and ATRX, which are predictive biomarkers for an extremely poor outcome, independent of and overriding every other factor. They are also mutually exclusive of each other, just like in neuroblastoma. And finally, there's one gene, RB1, which correlates to a very good response to chemotherapy. But it's not clear that it actually correlates to survival. My work has been presented at medical conferences nationally and internationally. It sparked the first ever Osteosarcoma conference in February of 2017. This Thursday, weather permitting, I will be giving a research seminar at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. And I've used this data and my analysis to convince 20 of the leading osteosarcoma docs across the United States to write and run a clinical trial for relapsed osteosarcoma, which is a combination of chemotherapy and targeted therapy based upon the tumor genetics. The protocol for this clinical trial is currently being written. One night, not several months after Daniel died, in that murky space of grief, depression, exhaustion, and insomnia, I had a crazy idea based on my own background. I'm a satellite communications network design engineer, a space engineer. And I wondered, could I treat the osteosarcoma cell signaling pathways as if they were a satellite communications network? Could I identify vulnerabilities called choke points in osteosarcoma? So I did. I applied SATCOM principles to osteosarcoma cell signaling. And one gene kept showing up again and again and again, ROC1, part of the Rho alpha pathway. So is ROC1 a choke point in osteosarcoma cell signaling? Is it a vulnerability in osteosarcoma that can be treated, that can be used and exploited as part of treatment? I don't know. But there's a doctor at the National Cancer Institute who has taken this idea and is testing it currently in her lab. I am, unfortunately, not the only grieving and desperate osteosarcoma parent. There are thousands and thousands of us across the United States. We all desperately want our children to survive. And so we formed a collaborative for to fund research and clinical trials of osteosarcoma. We're putting together a consortium of industrial partners and childhood cancer research foundations to fund and get the seed money for the clinical trial based on my research. We're pulling together funding from charitable sources and also venture capital to take a canine osteosarcoma drug and put it into a clinical trial for kids. And we've connected a researcher at the National Cancer Institute with a small biotech for translational research into osteosarcoma. And finally, we're working with a doctor at Dana-Farber to write up a fact sheet for pathologists so that they understand clearly how to get viable tumor tissue for osteosarcoma so that it is viable for genetic testing. My boy, my brave, beautiful, and beloved boy, it's all because of you. So where do we go from here? During Daniel's treatment and in the year and a half since his death, I've heard too many times to count that osteosarcoma is a very difficult disease, that it's an extremely aggressive disease, that it's just too difficult to tackle. I'm a space engineer. We do difficult. And like most people in my field, I've listened to and read JFK's speech from 1962 that started the space race. And JFK said, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is difficult." And I believe that we must choose to cure osteosarcoma, not because it is easy, but because it is difficult. We must choose to expend our energies and efforts in curing osteosarcoma, because as JFK said, that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. That challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one that we intend to win. I believe that we must choose to make a difference. We must choose to cure osteosarcoma. We must choose our children. We must choose hope. I choose hope. so that someone else's child will live. What do you choose? Thank you for listening to my story.